The stars had begun to die in the far reaches of the Imperium, their cold light flickering like the final breaths of an ancient, forgotten god. Great fortresses that had once bristled with the pride of unbroken fleets now drifted silently through the void, their weapons cold, their banners torn by the radiation of distant supernova. The void itself seemed to mourn, carrying the echoes of billions of souls lost to wars whose histories were already forgotten by those who survived. And in the center of this funeral of worlds, aboard the colossal battle barge Acheron's Resolve, the Iron Warrior's commander known as Praetor Zarak stood silently, watching the dying cosmos with eyes that had seen longer centuries than most mortals could comprehend. Before we begin the story, know that we truly love and care for you. The universe may be vast, merciless, and indifferent, but here, in these words, your presence matters. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Zarak's hands rested upon the cold alloy of the command throne, the metal etched with sigils of conquest and campaigns that stretched across thousands of star systems. He had once believed in the purity of purpose, in the strength of loyalty to the Imperium, yet time had shown him that even the most steadfast oaths could erode beneath the weight of ambition. His mind wandered, as it often did, through the tangled corridors of memory, recalling betrayals by men who had sworn their lives to him, and victories hollowed by the blood of those who had no choice in their fates. A war horn sounded faintly in the distance, a low resonance carried across the vacuum by magnetic pulse lines. The signal meant to rally his battle fleet for the siege of the asteroid world Korath Prime, stirred in Zarak a mixture of anticipation and dread. He had long understood that the measure of a commander was not in the victories he won, but in the weight he bore from every life taken under his command. Immortality, he had come to realize, was a curse that magnified regret rather than diminishing it. Outside the observation deck, Korath Prime loomed like a jagged wound against the black canvas of the void. Its surface had been scarred by centuries of conflict. Vast trenchworks carved into the rock, orbital defense platforms shattered by centuries-old bombardments, and cities whose once proud spires now lay in twisted heaps of metal and stone. The planet had resisted countless invasions, yet Zarak knew that the Iron Warrior's siege engines, honed to precision over millennia, would eventually consume every last resistance. Still, the thought brought him no satisfaction, only the hollow echo of inevitability. The Praetor's second in command, a grizzled captain named Valor, approached with measured steps. Each footfall was accompanied by the faint hiss of servo joints in his armored boots. "My lord," Valor said, his voice a low rasp over the comlink. Scouts report an unusual pattern in the planetary defense matrix. The Karathi have adapted their orbital defenses. We may face significant losses before the surface breach. Zarak turned his gaze from the dying star to the officer before him. "Adaptation is inevitable," he said quietly. "All resistance is inevitable. But it is not merely the enemy that must be weighed. It is the cost of victory, the cost of survival." His voice carried the gravity of centuries lived and battles fought. "Every world we take, every fortress we breach, leaves a shadow upon the soul of the man who commands it." Valor nodded slowly. "Do you ever regret it, my lord? The campaigns, the sieges, the lives taken." The question hung in the air, like a shard of ice. Zarak's mind flickered to the memory of a city burned for defiance, the smoke rising over the bodies of civilians who had nowhere to flee. The orders had been his, absolute and unquestioned, yet he had been the one to issue them with the cold logic of a strategist. not the warmth of conscience. And yet, regret lingered, a shadow that even immortality could not dispel. Regret, he said at last, is a luxury that one cannot afford in the midst of war. But remembrance is a burden we carry forever. The silence returned, oppressive and unyielding. The stars outside seemed dimmer now, as though the universe itself was listening, mourning, or perhaps judging. Zarek's eyes drifted to a small, unremarkable moon orbiting Korath Prime. In its quiet, grey desolation, he saw the reflection of his own soul, scarred, hollowed, and patient. For centuries he had waited, building empires from steel and iron, watching alliances crumble, watching men betray men. And now, as the engines of his fleet hummed with the promise of destruction, he wondered if all of it, the endless sieges, the centuries of conquest, had been worth the toll it had taken on his soul. A flicker of movement on the observation panel drew his attention. An incoming transmission, its energy signature faint and irregular, originating from deep within the Korathi defenses. Zarek's fingers hovered over the command interface. "Patch it through," he ordered. "I want to see who dares speak before their planet is reduced to ash." The image that resolved was both unexpected and disturbing. A lone figure, humanoid, yet marked with the strange insignia of an ancient, lost civilization, stared back at him. Their eyes were unyielding, a mirror to Zarek's own. The message was brief, but the weight of it was unmistakable. "You may take our world, Praetor, but you will not take our truth." Zarek studied the figure in silence. He recognized, as he always did in moments such as this, that war was never merely a contest of weapons or numbers. It was a contest of will, of purpose, and of the stories that each side carried into battle. The Korathi, like so many others before them, would fight to preserve what they believed sacred. And he, Zarek, would be the instrument that crushed them. And yet, in the depths of his mind, a seed of doubt took root. A whisper he could not ignore, asking whether conquest was worth the shadow it cast upon eternity. He turned from the observation deck and moved down the steel corridors of his flagship. The hum of the engines, the distant reverberations of servitors, and the metallic scent of the ship's atmosphere reminded him that he was, above all, a warrior and a commander. But he was also a man who had seen the consequences of absolute power, and perhaps, for the first time in centuries, he questioned whether absolute power could ever bring true dominion. As he entered the war chamber, Valor and his captains awaited his orders. The maps of Korath Prime floated in mid-air, dotted with orbital defenses and fortified positions. Each point represented countless lives, each battle a story of sacrifice and death. Zarek's voice cut through the tension like a blade of ice. "Prepare the siege engines. Begin orbital suppression. But mark my words, this will not be a victory without its toll. We will take the planet, yes, but it will cost us, and it will cost me most of all." The commanders nodded, accepting the burden as they always did. Yet, in the quiet that followed, Zarek allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Centuries of conquest had led him here, to the edge of another world, to the precipice of another moral abyss. And as the stars outside dimmed and the distant planets shivered under the weight of war, he understood something that few mortals could ever grasp. The true siege was not of worlds, but of the soul itself. The engines roared to life. The fleet moved into position. Korath Prime awaited. And Zarek, immortal and unyielding, carried with him the ghosts of 1,000 sieges, 1,000 betrayals, and the infinite weight of a conscience forged in steel and sorrow. Somewhere in the void, A dying sun cast its last red light across the galaxy, a warning or perhaps a benediction. And as the shadow of war stretched across Korath Prime, Zarek wondered, for the first time in millennia, whether he would ever find peace, or whether the endless sieges would claim him as inexorably as they claimed the worlds he conquered. The silence of space had a weight to it, as though the void itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next act of destruction to unfold. Praetor Zarek walked among his captains in the war chamber of Acheron's resolve, the flickering hololithic maps casting long, jagged shadows across the room. Every dot, every line of orbital defense represented lives, and yet in his mind, those lives were abstract, reduced to the necessary calculus of conquest. Still, he could not fully suppress the tremor that had begun to creep into his thoughts. The message from Korath Prime had lingered like a ghost, and its words haunted him more than any enemy, fire ever could. You may take our world, Praetor, but you will not take our truth. Vailor remained at his side, the grizzled captain's face as unreadable as ever beneath the reinforced helm of his command armor. They speak in riddles, he said, voice low, almost cautious. They are trying to unsettle you. Karathi are cunning, but not cunning enough to shake you. Zarek's eyes lingered on the projection of the planet, the jagged moon casting a pale, sorrowful light across its scarred surface. I do not fear them, Vailor, he said, but even he could hear the hesitation in his own voice. I fear what their defiance asks of me, the choice between efficiency and conscience. The Iron Warriors were a legion forged in the art of siegecraft, a brotherhood bound by steel and the shared understanding that victory demanded sacrifice. Yet even among his captains, Zarek sensed a growing tension, a whisper of unease that hinted at loyalties divided, hearts questioning, and the subtle erosion of unquestioned obedience. For centuries, he had relied on precision, discipline, and terror as tools of command. But terror alone could not answer the questions that now gnawed at him. Shall we prepare the assault on the northern fortress lines? Captain Draven asked, his gauntleted hands hovering over the command table. His voice carried both respect and ambition, the subtle edge of a mind already weighing how victory might serve his own standing. Zarek considered the question carefully. Yes, he replied, but not with blind haste. The northern fortifications are formidable, but the enemy's resolve is their true weapon. We must dismantle their will before their walls, or our losses will be higher than necessary. He paused, meeting Draven's gaze with the weight of centuries behind his eyes. And remember this, captains. The true cost of a siege is never measured in bodies alone. It is measured in the conscience of those who command them. The captains nodded, some with unease, others with the familiar satisfaction of strategic calculation. But Vailor lingered at the edge, his silence more telling than any words could be. Zarek knew that the captain's loyalty was unwavering, yet even he, Vailor, carried the scars of battles that had left him questioning the price of obedience. The Iron Warriors were soldiers of perfection, yet perfection was an unyielding mirror. It reflected every flaw in the soul that gazed into it. As the fleet moved into position around Korath Prime, Zarek allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Memories, like slow-moving shadows, drifted across his mind. He recalled the siege of Varkan 9, a world whose population had resisted for decades. He had given the order to breach its core defenses, and the resulting conflagration had left the planet's surface a smouldering wasteland. The victory had been absolute, yet in the silence that followed, he had felt the echo of every life, extinguished by his command. Centuries later, he still carried the weight of those choices. It was during these moments of solitude that the first cracks of doubt began to take form. Zarak, immortal and inexorably tied to the machinery of war, had once believed that conquest was its own justification. But Korath Prime was different. Its defenders fought not for glory or survival alone, but for a principle, a truth beyond the immediacy of life or death. And that truth forced Zarak to confront something he had long avoided. The realization that victory, even when complete, might not be absolute. In the command chamber, a flicker of movement drew his attention. A transmission, unmarked, bypassed all customary identification protocols. Zarak's brow furrowed. Only those with privilege or desperation could send messages directly to the praetor. With a gesture, he opened the feed. The image resolved slowly, revealing a figure shrouded in the ceremonial garb of the Karathi High Council. Their eyes, dark and unyielding, bore into him across the void of space, a challenge unspoken, yet understood. Praetor Zarak, the figure began, voice resonant, deliberate. You command armies forged in steel and terror, yet you are blind to the legacy you destroy. The walls will fall, but the truth endures beyond your reach. Even immortality cannot erase it. Zarak studied the figure. Every instinct screamed to dismiss them as propaganda, to reduce their words to noise. Yet the truth in their eyes, it was unnerving. He felt an echo of something he had long buried, empathy. Perhaps not for the enemy, but for the cost of his actions, upon the very soul he had vowed to preserve above all else. Vylor observed the exchange silently. When Zarak finally ended the feed, he spoke, voice measured. What is it, my lord? Does this message unsettle you? Zarak turned, eyes burning with an intensity that belied his centuries of experience. It does not unsettle me, Valor, he said. It reminds me that war is never absolute, that victory is measured not only by conquest, but by the scars left behind. This message is a mirror, and I do not like what I see. Reflected, the captain's expression remained neutral, though his eyes betrayed the faintest trace of concern. Then what shall we do? Zarak's hands gripped the edge of the hololithic table. We proceed with the siege, of course. Korath Prime will fall, yet we will do so with deliberation. Every assault, every strike must be measured. We take the planet, but we do not surrender our conscience entirely. A murmur ran through the captain's ranks. Some exchanged cautious glances. Some masked impatience beneath the rituals of duty. In the shadows of the chamber, ambition and loyalty waged their silent battle. For the first time, Zarak realized that the greatest threat to his command was not the enemy without, but the uncertainty that had begun to creep when within. Later, alone in the observation deck, Zarak allowed his thoughts to drift once more. The void beyond the viewport was vast, eternal, and indifferent. And yet within that indifference, he felt the weight of choice, the gravity of decisions that would echo through the centuries. Immortality, he mused, was not a gift. It was a burden that magnified every regret, every betrayal, every fleeting hesitation. Somewhere far below, Korath Prime's surface teemed with life, resistance, and the stubborn endurance of a people who would not bend without cost. Zarak had long understood that the measure of a commander was not only in the victories he won, but in the questions he asked of himself when no one else could see. And as the first volleys of orbital bombardment flared against the world, painting the night with fire and ruin, he wondered, for the first time in centuries, whether he had ever truly known what it meant to command with wisdom instead of fear. The engines hummed, the fleet moved, and the first siege of Korath Prime began. Yet even as destruction rained upon the planet, Zarak carried with him the unseen burden of doubt, a shadow that no armor, no discipline, and no conquest could ever fully contain. In the quiet of his immortal soul, he understood that this siege was only the beginning, not only of the battle for Korath Prime, but of the battles that would rage within himself for countless years to come. The bombardment of Korath Prime had begun in earnest. From orbit, the surface flared with firestorms that raced across the continent's scarred plains. Zarak watched from the observation deck, his eyes reflecting the inferno below, yet his face remained an unyielding mask of command. The fleet's engines thrummed like a heartbeat, the pulse of war itself echoing through the hull of Acheron's resolve. Centuries of sieges had taught him to expect resistance, but even he felt a gnawing unease at the defiance of this particular world. There was something stubborn, almost sacred, in the way the Korathi fought. Captain Draven approached, his armor clanking softly in the silent tension of the command chamber. "Sir," he said, gesturing toward the hololithic map, "they are consolidating forces in the northern highlands. It is unusual. They should have broken already." Zarak's fingers hovered over the projection. He could feel the weight of history pressing down upon him, the memory of countless worlds brought low by fire and iron. Yet Korath Prime resisted, and in that resistance he sensed the echo of an older, more enduring truth. "They fight not merely for survival," he murmured. "They fight for remembrance. And perhaps that is a weapon more dangerous than any we possess." Vailor remained at his side, silent, observing both the praetor and the maps. He had served Zarak for centuries, witnessing his victories and his rare, unspoken moments of doubt. "Their defiance may inspire others," Vailor said finally, his voice low. "If word reaches the neighboring systems, the Imperium may see a ripple of resistance beyond what we anticipate." Zarak considered this, the burning cities of Korath Prime mirrored in his mind by the countless worlds he had conquered. "Let them know fear," he said, his tone absolute, yet tinged with an internal tremor. "But let us not extinguish all hope. Even in conquest, one must leave a seed for reflection, or risk becoming a tyrant beyond the reckoning of the galaxy itself." A soft chime echoed through the chamber, signaling an incoming message from the fleet's reconnaissance corvettes. Zarak gestured for it to be patched through. The feed revealed a lone scout navigating the upper atmosphere, its sensors recording movement on the planet's surface. But the imagery was unusual. Clusters of figures moving in formations that defied conventional tactics, shifting patterns that suggested intelligence and cunning beyond their apparent capabilities. "They are not merely soldiers," Zarak observed. "They are strategists, architects of their own survival. And they will not yield easily," Draven frowned. "Sir, shall we adjust the orbital bombardment? Increase intensity?" Zarak shook his head. "No, the destruction has purpose, but indiscriminate fire will only breed deeper resistance. We measure, we calculate, we strike precisely. That is how empires fall and rise, through controlled inevitability, not chaos." He paused, turning his gaze to the viewport. "And yet, there is a price even in control. Every world we take, every life we extinguish, leaves a shadow upon us. That shadow does not fade with the passage of centuries. It endures, gnawing at the conscience of the man who commands." Vailor stepped forward, placing a hand upon Zarak's armored shoulder. "The shadow is necessary, my lord," he said. "We cannot command without consequence, and if we falter, the Imperium itself would crumble under indecision." Zarak's eyes met Vailor's, and in that gaze lay a recognition of both truth and regret. Yes, he admitted quietly. Yet I have begun to wonder if the weight of consequence has shifted. Perhaps I have carried the burden too long, and the empire itself has begun to carry me. A sudden alarm cut through the room, red lights flashing across the hololithic displays. The Northern Highlands had erupted in sudden, coordinated strikes, targeting the Iron Warriors' siege engines with precision and ferocity. Zarak's mind sharpened instantly. "Prepare countermeasures," he ordered. "Deploy interceptors to the Highlands. Vailor, take a command detachment and engage directly. Dreven, coordinate orbital bombardment to support them. Every strike must be measured." The captains moved with practiced efficiency, yet even in the midst of this orchestrated chaos, Zarak felt the stirrings of unease. The Karathi fought with a kind of courage he had rarely witnessed, a determination that defied the centuries of mortality he had long since transcended. And in that defiance, he glimpsed a reflection of his own struggle, the tension between duty, ambition, and the conscience he had spent lifetimes attempting to suppress. Hours passed in a blur of strategy, command orders, and the relentless roar of engines. The Highlands, once a formidable barrier, began to yield under the disciplined assault of the Iron Warriors. Yet even as victory edged closer, Zarak felt no triumph. Only the quiet gnaw of reflection, the sense that every calculated move carved deeper into the essence of who he was. Immortality had taught him patience, precision, and inevitability, but it had also taught him the unbearable weight of witnessing the cost of every decision. Later, in the solitude of his private chamber, Zarak allowed himself a rare indulgence. The chamber was sparse, its walls lined with the tools of war, relics of sieges past, and memorials to fallen warriors. Here, removed from the constant hum of engines and the unyielding gaze of his captains, he confronted the whispers of doubt that had begun to take root. He remembered the Karathi High Council's message: "You may take our world, Praetor, but you will not take our truth." What truth could survive the annihilation of cities, the collapse of governments, the unrelenting march of immortal legions? Zarak pondered the possibility that some truths were more resilient than the stars themselves, enduring beyond the violence of conquest, beyond the lifespan of empires, and perhaps even beyond the immortality he had been granted. A subtle vibration underfoot announced Vailor's entrance, though the captain spoke only once, softly. "You carry the burden, my lord, but you do not bear it alone. The Iron Warriors are with you. Even in doubt, even in shadow, we serve the purpose you define." Zarak nodded, his eyes tracing the faint scars etched into the chamber's walls. "Purpose or necessity?" he asked quietly. "Sometimes, Vailor, I wonder if we define purpose, or if purpose defines us. If every action we take is already determined by consequence, then what are we but instruments of inevitability?" Vailor said nothing, simply waiting for his commander's thoughts to unfold. Zarak's gaze drifted to a viewport, the stars beyond a distant and indifferent chorus. He understood in that moment that the siege of Korath Prime was more than a test of military might. It was a test of his own soul, a crucible in which the choices of centuries would be weighed and measured against the cost of mortality, loyalty, and ambition. As the engines of Acheron's resolve hummed through the vacuum, Zarak made a quiet vow. He would take Korath Prime, as the Iron Warriors always took their worlds. Yet he would carry its truth with him, as he had carried the truth of countless others. And somewhere in the endless void, amid the dying stars and shattered fortresses, he hoped that immortality might someday grant him the clarity to understand what victory truly demanded. The Northern Highlands erupted once more in the fires of battle, And Zarak, immortal, relentless, and burdened with the weight of eternity, watched as history unfolded beneath his command. And in the quiet spaces between the explosions, he realized that the true siege, the one of conscience, of doubt, and of shadowed loyalty, was only just beginning. The surface of Korath Prime burned beneath the relentless hammer of the Iron Warrior's siege engines. Even from orbit, the devastation was palpable. Cities flattened, forests incinerated, and the smoke of countless fires curling toward the blackness of space. Yet despite the inferno, the Korathi endured, their resistance clever and unyielding. Zarak, standing on the observation deck of Acheron's Resolve, felt the familiar pulse of immortality, the centuries of victories, the precision of conquests. But now an unfamiliar shadow lingered within him. Unease. He had faced treachery before, from mortals and warriors alike. Yet the subtle ripples in the loyalty of his own captains were harder to detect, harder to suppress. The Iron Warriors were disciplined beyond comprehension, yet even discipline could not entirely mask ambition, doubt, or fear. Vailor approached quietly, his armored presence a constant reassurance. "My lord," he said, voice low and measured. "Reports indicate a possible dissension among the southern detachments. Subtle, almost imperceptible. Communications are slightly irregular. Orders are followed, but not with the same precision." Zarak's eyes narrowed, scanning the hololithic projections of the battlefield. He had trained himself to detect such subtleties, to feel the pulse of his fleet as though it were an extension of his own mind. "Doubt is dangerous," he murmured, more to himself than to Vailor. "Even a single crack in the foundation can allow the entire fortress of command to collapse." The door hissed open, admitting Captain Draven and a junior officer named Merith. Both carried the crisp weight of unease, their posture precise yet tinged with subtle hesitation. Draven spoke first, his voice steady but careful. "My lord, we have intercepted Korathi transmissions. They are attempting to communicate between fortifications without using conventional channels. It is sophisticated, almost as if they anticipate our every move." Zarak's jaw tightened. So they adapt. They resist. And in doing so, they test not just our weapons, but our patience, our judgment, and our cohesion. He turned to Merith, his tone sharper. "Have your detachment observed any anomalies within the fleet? Any hesitancy among captains or officers?" Merith hesitated, an unusual human trait for one so well trained. "There have been minor delays, my lord. Tactical hesitations. No outright defiance, but perhaps an internal conflict. Among some of the senior officers, a shadow passed over Zarak's face, one rarely glimpsed by others. Internal conflict," he repeated softly, almost as if tasting the phrase. "The seeds of betrayal often begin with hesitation, and hesitation is a luxury no commander can afford." Vailor stepped closer, placing a firm hand upon Zarak's shoulder. "Suspicion will only grow if we do not act with clarity. You must decide whether this is doubt to be corrected, or a fracture to be healed, or ended." Zarak's gaze shifted to the viewport. Below, the northern highlands were scarred with the results of the first assaults, but the Korathi still maneuvered with a cunning born of desperation. The interplay of strategy and survival, the tension between life and death, reflected the internal battle he now faced. His fleet could annihilate the planet in hours, yet that victory would carry consequences not measured by bodies alone. It would ripple across his captain's loyalty, echo through centuries of history, and weigh upon his own conscience with the subtlety of a knife pressed against the mind. A sudden alert interrupted his thoughts. A southern detachment had halted, their siege engines idle, their crews murmuring amongst themselves in defiance too quiet to detect without careful scrutiny. Dreven leaned over the projection, fingers tracing the lines of resistance. "It is subtle, my lord," he said. "But there is hesitation, deliberate and coordinated, almost as if," his voice faltered, "as if they are testing you." Zarak's mind sharpened instantly. "Testing me," he echoed, a frost settling over his tone. "Then let them test. Let them understand that hesitation invites consequences. Every hesitation, every doubt, must be met with clarity of action. I will not allow shadows to undermine steel." Yet even as he spoke, an uneasy understanding settled in his chest. The Karathi were not merely resisting with weapons. They were probing, observing, exploiting the smallest fissures within his command. And within those fissures, he sensed a reflection of his own long-buried fears. The possibility that even those sworn to loyalty might falter, might betray, not out of malice, but from the subtle pull of conscience or ambition. Vailor's voice broke through the tension. "Shall we confront them directly, my lord? Identify the source of hesitation and reaffirm your command?" Zarak shook his head slowly, the weight of centuries pressing upon him. "No. Direct confrontation risks escalating suspicion into rebellion. We must act subtly, observe and guide. There is a lesson here, not only for my captains, but for myself. Control is never absolute. Even an immortal hand cannot shape all things without resistance." The command chamber fell silent, the hum of the fleet's engines filling the space with a rhythm almost alive. Zarak allowed himself a brief moment to reflect, tracing the memories of past sieges, past betrayals, past victories hollowed by conscience. He remembered the siege of Varkan 9, where a single officer had hesitated in the heat of battle, costing thousands of lives. Yet the hesitation had been human, inevitable, and in some way necessary, to remind him that the instruments of war were not flawless. They were bound by will, ambition, and fear. A soft chime heralded another incoming transmission. Zarak's brow furrowed. Only those with courage or desperation could reach him at this level. The feed resolved, revealing an unexpected face. A subordinate from the southern detachment, their expression tight with tension. "Praetor Zarak," the officer began, voice carefully modulated. We have reservations about the orders. The destruction, its magnitude. Many among the detachment question whether this is the only path. We seek clarification, guidance." Zarak's gaze bore into the figure on the hololithic projection. His first instinct was to issue immediate command, to quash hesitation with authority alone. But centuries of experience and the lingering whispers of doubt urged restraint. "Guidance is not always clarity," he said slowly. "Sometimes it is the courage to act when certainty is impossible. Your hesitation is noted. Reflect upon it. Decide where your loyalty lies, with survival, with obedience, or with conscience." The projection flickered as the officer's eyes widened, caught between fear and understanding. We will follow your command, my lord," they said finally. Zarak ended the transmission and turned to Vailor. "See that they do," he said, "but also watch them. The mind that hesitates may yet teach us something or betray us entirely, and in both cases, wisdom demands vigilance." Vailor inclined his head, silent acknowledgement of the delicate path they now walked. Zarak returned his gaze to the viewport, watching the fires rage across Korath Prime. The destruction was complete in appearance, yet incomplete in spirit. The Karathi endured, and so too did the uncertainty within his own command. For centuries, he had commanded legions, crushed empires, and orchestrated sieges that would be remembered for millennia. Yet in that moment, he understood that the greatest sieges were not of cities or fortresses, but of trust, loyalty, and conscience. The true test of an immortal warrior was not the skill of his hand or the power of his fleets. It was the endurance of his mind, the courage to navigate shadows cast not by enemies, but by those closest to him. The northern highlands flared once more under the assault, and Zarak, immortal and burdened with centuries of experience, realized with a cold certainty that the battle for Korath Prime was as much within his own command as it was upon the planet itself. And somewhere in the endless void, amidst dying stars and the weight of eternity, he wondered whether even he, with all the steel and strategy of millennia, could ever truly master the hearts and minds of those who served him. The smoke of Korath Prime drifted upward, like the fingers of a dead god, twisting through the void as if reaching for absolution. From orbit, the planet's surface was a tapestry of fire and ruin, yet the patterns of resistance were undeniable. Zarak stood on the observation deck of Acheron's Resolve, eyes unblinking, his mind a steel prism reflecting centuries of siegecraft, conquest, and the unspoken weight of immortality. Even now, as orbital bombardments leveled fortified positions with mechanical precision, he felt a tremor of unease within the structure of his command. Vailor approached without sound, the steady presence of his oldest confidant grounding Zarak in the moment. "My lord," he said, voice low and deliberate, "the southern detachments have begun reporting anomalies in supply coordination. There is hesitation, subtle delays. It is not outright defiance, but it is there." Zarak's hand hovered over the console, tracing the orbiting fleet's positions as if he could feel the pulse of every vessel through the cold steel of his fingertips. "Subtle delays," he murmured. "It is always subtle at first. Small fissures widen over time, and once they split the foundation, nothing holds the weight of command." He turned to Vailor, the weight of centuries in his gaze. "We have faced mortal treachery before, but the question now is different. How do we command men who doubt the purpose of conquest itself?" Vailor remained silent, understanding that the answer was neither simple nor immediate. He had watched Zarak weigh the conscience of his immortal hand against the loyalty of mortals countless times before, and each time it had left a shadow in both their minds. The hololithic display flickered, signaling a communication from a southern detachment. Zarak gestured for it to be patched through. The projection resolved into the image of Captain Lyran, a figure who had long served with the Iron Warriors, but now appeared uncertain, almost hesitant. "Praetor Zarak," Lyran began, voice carefully measured, "we seek clarification regarding the continued bombardment. Our detachments, some of our officers, question whether the level of destruction is necessary. There are moral objections." Zarak's jaw tightened. Morality, a concept he had long relegated to abstract consideration, was now encroaching upon his command. He studied Lyran's face, searching for signs of malice or deceit, but saw only human hesitation, the natural fragility of mortals confronting the machinery of absolute power. "Morality," he said finally, "is a luxury of those who do not bear the weight of command. You have been entrusted with the continuation of this siege. That trust is absolute. You act not out of personal preference, but according to the strategy I define." Lyran's expression faltered, though she nodded. "Yes, my lord. Understood. We will comply." Zarak ended the transmission and turned to Vailor. "Observe her closely. Hesitation is not always treachery, but in war, even hesitation can carry consequences beyond calculation. Prepare contingency measures. If doubt spreads, we must act decisively. Vailor inclined his head, silent acknowledgement of the delicate balance. Shall we confront the dissenting officers directly? He asked. No, Zarak replied, voice firm. Confrontation breeds resistance, subtle guidance, observation, and the awareness that all actions are seen. That is the path. We will shape their loyalty without breaking it, or at least without shattering what remains intact. Hours passed in a tense rhythm. The orbital bombardments continued, while small tactical deployments engaged in the highlands below. Despite the efficiency of his forces, the subtle currents of doubt and hesitation persisted. Zarak, for the first time in centuries, began to see the cracks not only in his captains, but within himself. Immortality had allowed him to witness the rise and fall of countless empires. Yet the human element, the fragility, ambition, and conscience of those who followed him, was unpredictable, uncontrollable, and unnervingly powerful. A soft chime heralded a private message from a lieutenant within the northern siege lines. Zarak accessed it immediately. The message was brief, almost cryptic. Some question, some whisper, some fear. You are watched as well, Praetor. For a long moment, he said nothing. The weight of the words pressed against his consciousness. Even immortals are not immune to uncertainty, and the insinuation that he himself was under scrutiny sent a ripple of calculated unease through his mind. Who watches? He demanded, voice calm, yet edged with authority. The feed flickered, then ended. There was no further explanation. Zarak stared at the hololithic projection, the red light of distant fire reflecting in his eyes. The Karathi were resilient, yes, but now he sensed another layer of opposition, one not measured in bullets or engines, but in vigilance, suspicion, and the subtle threat of betrayal among his own. Vailor's voice cut through the silence. We must consider that loyalty is not uniform, my lord. Even the Iron Warriors are not impervious to doubt. It is a seed, and seeds grow quietly. We will root it out, or it will root itself in others. Zarak's lips pressed into a thin line. Doubt is inevitable, he murmured, but we do not crush the seed blindly. We observe, we guide, and we act when the time is precise. Patience, Vailor. Patience is a weapon as sharp as any blade. Later, in the solitude of his private chamber, Zarak allowed himself to confront the weight of his own reflections. The walls were lined with relics of conquest, banners taken from fallen worlds, weapons etched with the marks of centuries of sieges, and memorials to warriors who had followed his command without question. And yet, even among these symbols of absolute authority, he felt the unease that came from within. The Karathi High Council's earlier message lingered in his mind. You may take our world, Praetor, but you will not take our truth. Zarak understood now that their truth extended beyond the battlefield. It was a reflection of his own doubt, mirrored through the hesitations and questions of those who served him. Even immortals could be challenged, not only by enemies, but by the subtle, unspoken rebellions of conscience and ambition. A quiet knock at the chamber door announced the presence of Merith, the junior officer who had first reported the anomalies among the southern detachments. Praetor, she said softly, I have been observing the detachments. Some officers speak in whispers, questioning your orders, not in disobedience, but in concern. They fear the toll of conquest, the cost of what we do. Zarak considered her carefully. And what do you fear, Merith? She hesitated, a rare vulnerability betraying the strict discipline of the Iron Warriors. I fear that even immortals cannot bear the weight of what we destroy without consequence, that we may win and yet lose something far greater than any world. Zarak's eyes lingered on her, the reflection of a truth long buried surfacing once more. The human element, fragile yet potent, could not be ignored. Even centuries of conquest, centuries of victory, could not erase the consequences of choice, or the inevitability of moral reckoning. He turned back to the viewport, watching the fires dance across the scarred surface of Korath Prime. The northern highlands still resisted, the southern detachments whispered, and somewhere in the quiet corners of his fleet, doubt had taken root. Zarak understood, with a clarity born of centuries, that the true siege of Korath Prime, of his captains, and of his own conscience was only beginning. And in that understanding, he found a subtle, terrible resolve. He would see the world fall under the Iron Warrior's might. He would measure the hesitation of those who served him, and he would endure the weight of eternity with all its doubts. Immortality, he realized, was not merely a gift of longevity. It was the ceaseless burden of witnessing consequence and the unending responsibility of choice. The fires below flared once more, and Zarak, unyielding, immortal, and burdened with the knowledge of both conquest and doubt, prepared for the trials yet to come. The siege would continue, but the war, both within and without, had only just begun. The void beyond Korath Prime was silent, yet that silence carried a tension sharper than any battle cry. Zarak stood on the observation deck of Acheron's Resolve, the ghostly reflection of burning cities mirrored in his eyes. The northern highlands had finally begun to crumble under the relentless assault of Iron Warriors' siege engines, yet the world itself seemed to resist surrender. Even amidst devastation, the pulse of life, stubborn, defiant, persisted in scattered pockets of resistance. Zarak, immortal and unyielding, could sense it, a heartbeat of defiance that no fire could entirely extinguish. Vylor approached, his armored presence a grounding force. "The detachments report further hesitations, my lord," he said quietly. Not outright defiance, but whispers grow louder. Some captains question the necessity of continued devastation, while others, he paused, voice careful, others appear to doubt your judgment entirely. Zarak did not flinch. "Doubt is the shadow that follows all command," he replied. "Yet it is a shadow I cannot ignore. Observation alone will not suffice. We must guide, correct, and when necessary, assert absolute clarity." Dreven entered the chamber then, bringing with him the faint hum of nervous energy. His voice was clipped, but his tone betrayed a subtle tension. "My lord, the southern detachments have begun to act independently of protocol. They follow orders, yet there are deviations. Minor, almost imperceptible, but deliberate. Some officers are coordinating among themselves, without reporting to command." Zarak's eyes narrowed, the weight of centuries pressing down upon his shoulders. "Coordination without oversight," he murmured. "A dangerous curiosity, or a nascent betrayal. Observe them closely, Dreven. Track every action, every whisper, every hesitation." Vylor's hand rested lightly on the praetor's shoulder. "It is natural for mortals to question, my lord. Even within the Iron Warriors, centuries of discipline cannot eradicate the human element entirely. The question is not whether doubt exists, it is whether it can be contained." Zarak turned from the observation viewport, his voice low and deliberate. "Containment alone is insufficient. We will guide it, shape it, and if necessary, sever it before it infects the foundation of command. The Iron Warriors are disciplined, yes, but they are not immune to ambition, fear, or conscience. And conscience is the most dangerous weapon of all. A soft chime heralded another transmission, this one from Lieutenant Merith, who had long been observant of the subtler dynamics among the southern detachments. The feed resolved into her expression, tense yet composed. "Praetor Zarak," she began, "I have been monitoring the detachments closely. The whispers are growing into discussions, subtle arguments about the morality of our actions. Some officers suggest curtailing the bombardment in favor of precision strikes. Others question whether our approach aligns with the principles you embody." Zarak's hand rested upon the edge of the command console, the cold metal grounding him in the moment. "Principles," he said slowly, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. "Even immortals must wrestle with them. Yet in command, the necessity of action outweighs moral preference. Observe, Merith. Guide. And if guidance fails, intervene. Do not hesitate." The feed ended, leaving Zarak in the silent hum of the command chamber. The fires of Korath Prime flared beneath him, illuminating the scarred surface like the embers of a dying star. Even amidst annihilation, the resistance endured, a testament to the stubbornness of life and the persistence of truth. Zarak felt the weight of his own immortality pressing down upon him. For centuries, he had commanded legions, brought entire worlds to heel, and orchestrated sieges that would be remembered for millennia. Yet the human element, the hesitation, doubt, and conscience of those who served him, was unpredictable, uncontrollable, and in its own way, terrifying. Valor spoke again, voice quiet but resolute. "You must prepare for the possibility that some will betray their own judgment entirely. Even the smallest act of defiance, if left unchecked, can unravel discipline and sow chaos." Zarak nodded, his mind tracing the memory of past sieges, past betrayals, past victories hollowed by conscience. He recalled the siege of Varkan 9, where hesitation among a single officer had cost thousands of lives. The memory was both a caution and a reminder. Loyalty, no matter how disciplined, was never absolute. The command chamber dimmed as the hololithic displays shifted to the southern theaters of war. Small tactical engagements unfolded with precision, yet there were anomalies, patterns of movement that deviated from orders, supply convoys that lingered too long, communications that flickered before response. Dreven's voice cut through the hum. "Sir, the southern detachments. Some captains coordinate independently, even as they maintain outward obedience. It is subtle, but it is deliberate." Zarak's jaw tightened. "Deliberate, indeed. We will allow observation to continue, but no act, however minor, may compromise the cohesion of the siege. Every hesitation is a test, not only of the world below, but of the loyalty of those who serve me." Vyla's hand remained on his shoulder, a silent reassurance. "And what of yourself, my lord? Do these uncertainties weigh upon you?" Zarak's gaze shifted to the viewport, to the smoke curling above Korath Prime's cities. "They do," he admitted softly, "but not as doubt of command. The weight I carry is the reflection of consequence. Even immortals are bound to the outcomes of their actions and the conscience of those who follow them. This siege is a crucible, not only for Korath Prime, but for the Iron Warriors themselves, and for my own understanding of purpose and morality." A subtle alarm interrupted the conversation, drawing attention to a small cluster of detachments acting with uncharacteristic initiative. Their actions were neither disobedient nor incompetent. Yet they suggested coordination beyond their immediate orders. Draven leaned over the console, analyzing patterns. "It is deliberate," he murmured. "They are testing boundaries, seeing how far they may deviate without reprisal." Zarek's mind sharpened instantly. "Then we will show them the consequences of hesitation. Not through blind punishment, but through measured precision. Let them see that loyalty is both observed and required. And yet, let them also know that conscience is not erased entirely, lest obedience become tyranny rather than command." The chamber fell into a tense quiet. The fires of Korath Prime flared once more, and Zarek allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Immortality had granted him perspective, strategy, and understanding across centuries. Yet it had also exposed him to the subtle, dangerous complexities of loyalty, ambition, and conscience among those who served him. Even the Iron Warriors, forged in discipline and perfected in the art of siege, were not immune to hesitation, doubt, or moral questioning. Vilo's voice, calm and unwavering, broke the silence. "We act, observe, and guide. But we remain vigilant. The seed of doubt is small, yet it grows swiftly if left unchecked. The siege is not only of a planet, it is of the hearts and minds of those who serve, and the mind of the Praetor himself." Zarek's gaze lingered on the distant fires. The northern highlands were crumbling, the southern detachments whispering, and the weight of eternity pressed upon him like the pull of a distant, dying sun. He understood, with clarity born of centuries, that this siege was more than a test of military might. It was a crucible of loyalty, conscience, and the burdens of command. The true war, he realized, raged not only upon Korath Prime, but within the hearts of his captains and within his own immortal mind. And as the smoke twisted toward the void, he resolved silently. He would see the siege through. He would shape the loyalty of his captains, and he would endure the weight of consequence, whatever it may bring. The battle was far from over, and the war of conscience had only just begun. The northern highlands of Korath Prime were aflame, yet the fire could not cleanse the stubborn pulse of resistance that throbbed beneath the scarred earth. Zarek observed from the bridge of Acheron's resolve, his immortal eyes tracing the intricate patterns of both devastation and defiance. The siege had stretched for weeks, a symphony of steel, fire, and unrelenting calculation. Yet the Korathi endured in ways he had not anticipated. They adapted, shifted, and struck with precision that rivaled his own strategies, a defiance that gnawed at the edges of even his centuries-honed confidence. Vylor approached silently, the faint clank of his armor, a reminder of his ever-present vigilance. "My lord," he said, voice low, "our scouts report that the northern highlands have shifted their tactics. They are engaging in coordinated counterstrikes against our siege engines. Casualties are rising faster than anticipated." Zarek's gaze did not waver from the viewport. The image of a collapsed fortification, flaring with the remnants of fire and smoke, reflected his own thoughts. That strategy alone could not guarantee mastery. That unpredictability lurked not only in the enemy, but also in those who executed his will. "Casualties," he murmured. "Every fallen soldier leaves a trace upon the conscience of those who command, and every hesitation, every doubt, carries consequences that echo far beyond the battlefield." Dreven stepped forward, projecting a hololithic overlay of the northern front. Tiny red markers shifted irregularly, suggesting a degree of tactical intelligence that unsettled even seasoned Iron Warriors. "Sir, the Korathi are not merely resisting, they are learning, adapting. Our siege engines are being targeted with foresight. Whoever commands them understands the pattern of our assault." Zarak's armored hand rested lightly upon the console, feeling the vibration of energy flowing through the vessel as though it were an extension of his own will. "Adaptation is inevitable," he said, voice quiet but absolute. "Even immortals cannot foresee every movement, every thought. We counter, we endure, we shape the battlefield as we may. But we must also respect that resistance is not merely a force to be crushed. It is a reflection of the choices we make." Vailor's gaze met his own, steady and unwavering. "And what of the loyalty of our captains, my lord? The southern detachments, still murmuring, still questioning. If they falter, it may embolden others." Zarak exhaled slowly, the weight of centuries pressing upon him. "Then we guide them. Loyalty is forged in observation, tempered by expectation, and, if necessary, polished with consequences. Doubt is not eradicated, it is directed, and in this crucible the Iron Warriors shall endure or fail." A subtle alarm cut through the quiet hum of the bridge. Dreven's fingers flew over the console. "Sir, an unanticipated strike has breached the southeastern lines. The enemy appears to anticipate our movements before we execute them. This is not random. It is deliberate." Zarak's eyes sharpened. "Then it is time to strike with clarity, precision, and inevitability. Vailor, take a command detachment. Engage directly. Measure their response. Dreven, coordinate orbital support to contain them. Every movement must serve a purpose. Every hesitation will be recorded." As the fleet mobilized, Zarak allowed a rare moment of reflection. Immortality had taught him patience, strategy, and calculation. Yet the subtle human elements, the hesitations, the whispers of doubt among his captains, the Karathi's unexpected ingenuity, reminded him that even centuries of conquest could not erase the unpredictability of choice. Even the Iron Warriors, disciplined and relentless, were subject to the fragility of will. Vailor departed to lead the detachment, leaving Zarak alone with the hum of engines and the distant roar of bombardment. He contemplated the subtle fractures within his command, whispers among officers, minor deviations from orders, hesitation where none should exist. These were not acts of outright defiance, but they were threads that, if left unchecked, could unravel the cohesion of the entire siege. And yet he also recognized the value of their humanity. The Iron Warriors were not merely instruments, they were minds, each capable of choice, doubt, and reflection. A soft chime heralded a direct communication from Captain Lyran of the southern detachments. Her face appeared, taut with tension, yet resolute. "Praetor Zarak," she said, "we have observed the southeastern counterstrikes. They are more organized than expected. Some of our officers question whether the current level of destruction is the most effective method. There is internal debate." Zarak studied her carefully, noting the careful balance between obedience and concern. "Lyran," he said finally, "debate among mortals is inevitable. But action is the measure of command. Guide your detachments. Correct where necessary. Observe and ensure that loyalty endures. Hesitation is acceptable only to the degree that it informs strategy, not undermines it." Lyran inclined her head, understanding the weight behind his words. "Understood, my lord," she said. As the communication ended, Zarak allowed himself a brief, rare sigh. The Karathi were clever, persistent, and unyielding. The Iron Warriors were disciplined, but subtle fractures had begun to appear. Whispers, minor deviations, hesitant movements, and somewhere within those tiny fissures lay the potential for betrayal. Hours passed in tense calculation, the fires of Korath Prime illuminating the scarred landscape like embers of a dying sun. The Iron Warriors advanced methodically, crushing fortifications and subduing resistance, yet the true battle raged not only on the surface, but within the hearts of the officers executing the orders. Vylor returned from the front lines, his expression unreadable. "They adapt faster than expected, my lord," he said. "Some detachments hesitate not out of fear, but calculation. They test boundaries, probe weaknesses, and I suspect some watch you as closely as we watch them." Zarak's eyes, immortal and precise, met Valor's. "Then we shall show them that loyalty, though tested, is unwavering. Yet we also acknowledge that choice exists, even in obedience. To command without awareness of consequence is to become a tyrant. We must measure both strategy and conscience, for the two are intertwined." The fires below flared once more, the northern highlands crumbling under siege engines. Yet pockets of resistance remained, striking with sudden ferocity and cunning. Zarak allowed himself a rare reflection. Immortality was not the absence of consequence, but its endless accumulation. The Battle of Korath Prime was not merely against mortals. It was against time, memory, doubt, and the subtle, unspoken truths that lingered even in the hearts of his own captains. And as the smoke twisted toward the void, Zarak resolved that the siege would continue with precision, that loyalty would be observed and directed, and that the true war, the war of conscience, doubt, and command, had only just begun. The stars above were indifferent witnesses, yet their light fell upon a battlefield as much internal as external, a crucible in which the immortal praetor and his mortals would be tested beyond the reckoning of centuries. The ash-choked skies of Korath Prime reflected the chaos below, a canvas of fire and ruin upon which the stubborn defiance of the planet's defenders was etched. Zarak stood upon the bridge of Acheron's resolve, the flickering reflections of devastation dancing across his immortal features. The northern highlands had largely succumbed to relentless bombardment, yet the southern detachments, those subtle nodes of hesitation and whispered dissent, had become the true crucible of his command. He felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon him, not the weight of conquest, but the subtle, insidious burden of choice. Vylor approached without sound, his presence a constant reassurance against the silent, pressing tension. "My lord," he said quietly, "the southern detachments grow bolder in their hesitation. Reports indicate that some captains coordinate independently, suggesting a possible emerging faction within the ranks. It is small, but deliberate." Zarak's jaw tightened, a shadow passing over his otherwise composed features. Deliberate, yes, and dangerous. A fissure begins as a hairline crack, yet can become a chasm if unheeded. We will observe, measure, and guide. And if guidance fails, his words trailed, heavy with unspoken consequence. Draven entered the chamber, projection tablet in hand. "Sir, reconnaissance indicates the Karathi are not only resisting, they are countering in ways that suggest inside knowledge of our movements. There is reason to suspect that hesitation among our own officers may have allowed them this insight. Communication anomalies are growing, subtle yet consistent. Some detachments operate in unison, yet without reporting their coordination." Zarak's armored fingers traced the edge of the console, feeling the pulse of energy flow beneath his touch. Immortality had taught him patience, precision, and observation, yet the human element, hesitation, doubt, and ambition, remained a variable he could never fully control. "We will illuminate the cracks," he said at last. "And if those cracks widen, we will determine whether they are caused by fear, conscience, or ambition. Each requires a different response, yet all demand attention." A soft chime heralded an incoming communication. The projection resolved into Captain Lyran, her posture taut, her face composed, but shadows of uncertainty flickering across her features. Praetor Zarak, she began. The southeastern siege lines report further coordination anomalies. Some officers are bypassing standard reporting channels, seemingly confident in their judgment over strict orders. They question whether continued bombardment is the most effective method. There is discussion, quiet but consistent. Zarak studied her carefully. Lyran, he said, voice measured. Hesitation is not necessarily defiance. Observe them, guide where necessary. But remember this, loyalty is both a privilege and an expectation. Conscience informs action, yet it must not undermine command. Ensure they understand the distinction. Lyran inclined her head. Understood, my lord. As the communication ended, Zarak allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. Immortality was a double-edged blessing. It granted perspective and foresight, yet it exposed him to the subtle complexities of human conscience that persisted even among the most disciplined warriors. The Iron Warriors were forged in discipline, yet the whispers, the quiet hesitations, had begun to echo louder in the corridors of command. Even subtle acts of questioning carried weight, carrying the potential to unravel cohesion if left unchecked. Vailor's voice, quiet yet unwavering, broke the silence. And what of yourself, my lord? Even the immortal hand must recognize the strain of such uncertainty. Zarak's gaze returned to the viewport, where fires flared against the darkened landscape. Strain is inevitable, he admitted. But it is not weakness. It is recognition. Recognition that command is not merely the exercise of power, but the stewardship of choice. Each hesitation, each whisper, must be weighed not only for immediate consequence, but for its ripple across centuries. Even immortals cannot ignore the echoes of conscience. A sudden alert disrupted the quiet meditation. Dreven's voice was sharp. Sir, an unanticipated strike has breached the western siege lines. Casualties are higher than predicted. The enemy demonstrates knowledge of our internal patterns. We suspect coordination beyond the battlefield. Zarak's eyes narrowed. Then it is time for clarity, he said, voice low and deliberate. Vailor, lead a detachment directly to the western line. Measure their strength, observe their intentions, and assert control where necessary. Dreven, coordinate orbital suppression to contain them. Every movement must reinforce loyalty. Every hesitation must be examined. As Vailor departed, Zarak allowed a rare reflection upon the weight of command. He had faced mortal treachery before, yet this subtle network of whispers, hesitation, and possible factionalism was unlike any challenge he had encountered in centuries of conquest. It was a test not only of his strategy, but of the resilience of those who executed his orders, and of his own capacity to balance absolute authority with the recognition of conscience. Hours passed as the orbital bombardments continued, the ground assault progressing with mechanical precision. Yet beneath the surface of discipline, the quiet rumble of internal tension persisted. Officers debated quietly, captains exchanged coded signals, and minor deviations from orders, while subtle, had begun to compound into discernible patterns. A new communication flickered to life. This time it was Lieutenant Merith, her expression composed but shadowed by tension. Praetor Zarak, she began, I have observed the detachments closely. Some officers are coordinating without reporting, questioning strategy and subtly influencing their subordinates. It is not open defiance, but it is deliberate. They test boundaries, and I suspect some are watching you as closely as we watch them. Zarak's armored hand rested upon the console, the pulse of the vessel beneath his touch, a grounding reminder of control and precision. Then we observe, measure, and respond with exactitude, he said softly. Every action, every whisper, carries consequence. The test is ongoing, but the outcome will be determined by discernment as much as by strength. The fires of Korath Prime flared once more, and Zarak felt the weight of eternity press upon him. Immortality was not the absence of consequence. It was the accumulation of every choice, every hesitation, every act of loyalty or doubt. The siege of Korath Prime was no longer merely a battle of siege engines, fire and steel. It was a crucible of conscience, loyalty, and command. And as the smoke twisted skyward, Zarak understood with cold clarity that the true test had only begun. The Karathi resisted not only with force, but with cunning. His officers hesitated, whispered, and observed. And he, immortal, unyielding, burdened with centuries of experience, was as much a participant in the siege of conscience as any mortal, navigating the subtle treacheries and moral complexities that would determine the future of both the planet and the Iron Warriors themselves. The smoke of Korath Prime had become a permanent shroud, curling around cities like the fingers of a vengeful god. Zarak stood upon the bridge of Acheron's resolve, watching the fires burn, feeling the rhythm of mortality in every flicker of flame. The northern highlands had fallen, reduced to ash and shattered stone, but the southern detachments, with their whispers and hesitant movements, had begun to demand a deeper attention. They were no longer simply soldiers. They were agents of conscience, subtle vectors of doubt whose allegiance could tip the balance of victory or invite catastrophe. Vailor approached silently, as he always did, his armor echoing the weight of centuries of loyal service. "My lord," he said quietly, "the southern detachments have taken a new course of action. They act with coordination beyond prior expectations. There are officers who speak in quiet council, some even questioning the necessity of our ongoing devastation. Others, more concerning, may be scheming in ways we cannot yet observe." Zarak's jaw tightened. He had seen countless sieges, countless rebellions, yet the subtleties of human conscience, morality intertwined with ambition, had always been his greatest challenge. "Scheming is not the problem," he said, voice low, deliberate. "The problem is hesitation. Every action, every whisper, every concealed doubt carries consequence. If left unchecked, it will fracture cohesion, and once cohesion fractures—" He trailed off, allowing the silence to emphasize the unspoken threat. Draven entered the chamber, a projection tablet flickering in his hands. "Sir, reconnaissance indicates that several southern captains have coordinated among themselves, sharing strategic observations and questioning the orders they receive. Their movements are deliberate, almost imperceptibly subversive, and yet they maintain outward compliance. This is no random hesitation. It is organized, subtle, and dangerous." Zarak's armored hand pressed lightly against the console, feeling the vibration of energy beneath him as though it were an extension of his own will. Immortality had given him centuries of foresight, yet the human element, the hesitation, the doubt, the latent ambition, remained a variable that could not be fully contained. "Observe, measure, and guide," he said at last. "The line between loyalty and betrayal is thin. We will not act prematurely, but we will act decisively when the moment arrives. And that moment will arrive." A chime heralded a direct communication from Captain Lyran. Her expression was composed, but the tension in her eyes betrayed the undercurrent of doubt rippling through the southern detachments. "Praetor Zarak," she began. The southern detachments report that certain officers are taking independent action. They question the continued bombardment and debate the necessity of total destruction. There is unrest, subtle but persistent. Some captains even suggest restraint in specific theaters of war, prioritizing strategic preservation over annihilation. Zarak studied her carefully. Lyran, hesitation is expected. Conscience is an unpredictable force, even among the most disciplined. Guide your detachments, correct where necessary, and remind them that loyalty is a privilege earned, not an automatic inheritance. Every whisper, every doubt, carries a weight that may tip the scales. Lyran inclined her head. "Understood, my lord," she said, though her eyes betrayed the faintest trace of worry. The fires below twisted in chaotic patterns, reflecting the subtle and intricate conflicts that now mirrored the physical devastation of Korath Prime. Even among those who followed his command, doubt had begun to crystallize into something almost tangible, a silent rebellion that could fracture the cohesion of centuries of disciplined order. Vailor's voice broke through the quiet hum of the bridge. "And what of the loyalty of your inner circle, my lord? Even immortals may be observed and tested in ways imperceptible to the untrained eye." Zarak's gaze shifted from the viewport to Vailor, a rare flicker of vulnerability crossing his features. "Yes, even I am not immune. The weight of command, the observation of my officers, and the endless calculus of consequence, they all press upon the mind, even that of an immortal. Yet hesitation is not sin. It is awareness. Awareness that each choice bears the weight of consequence, and that the hearts of those who serve may betray as easily as they follow." The bridge fell silent as a subtle alarm sounded. Dreven's voice was tight, precise. "Sir, an unanticipated strike has breached the eastern siege lines. Casualties are higher than anticipated, and the strike demonstrates insight into our internal patterns. Coordination beyond our expectation suggests deliberate interference. The southern detachments may have informed this action, or at least failed to prevent it." Zarak's gaze sharpened, the weight of centuries pressing upon his mind. "Then it is time for clarity. Vailor, lead a detachment to assess the breach, determine its origin, and measure the loyalty of all officers involved. Dreven, coordinate orbital suppression to contain the threat. Every movement, every decision must reinforce discipline while preserving the subtle balance between obedience and conscience." As Vailor departed, Zarak remained on the bridge, contemplating the burden of choice that immortality had imposed upon him. He had seen countless empires rise and fall, observed legions crumble, and witnessed betrayal in countless forms. Yet nothing had prepared him for the quiet, insidious rebellion of conscience within his own ranks. The subtle hesitation, the whispered counsel, the calculated deviations from orders. Hours passed as the siege continued with mechanical precision. The fires of Korath Prime illuminated the scarred landscape like the embers of a dying sun. Yet beneath the surface of disciplined advance, subtle fractures persisted. Officers whispered among themselves. Captains coordinated without authority. And the quiet tension of doubt hung over the southern detachments like a storm cloud. A new communication flickered to life. This time it was Lieutenant Merith, her expression composed, yet tense. "Praetor Zarak," she began, "I have observed the detachments closely. Some officers have begun to act with coordination and independence that surpasses prior anomalies. They speak quietly of restraint, of alternative strategies, and of questioning orders. It is not disobedience, but it is deliberate and calculated. I suspect some observe your actions as closely as you observe theirs. Zarak's armored hand rested upon the console, feeling the pulse of the vessel beneath him, a grounding reminder of control amidst uncertainty. Then we observe, measure, and respond. Every action, every whisper, every hesitation carries consequence. The test of loyalty, of obedience, of conscience is ongoing, and I will endure it as I always have. The fires of Korath Prime flared once more, the smoke rising into the void, twisting toward the stars. Zarak understood, with the clarity of centuries, that the siege was no longer merely a battle of fire and steel. It was a crucible of conscience, a test of loyalty, and a reflection of the burdens of command. Immortality did not spare one from consequence. It ensured that each choice, each hesitation, each act of loyalty or doubt would echo across eternity. And as the smoke twisted skyward, Zarak resolved silently. He would see the siege through. He would measure the loyalty of his captains, and he would endure the weight of conscience, ambiguity, and consequence, no matter the cost. The war of Korath Prime was far from over, and the subtle betrayals within his own ranks had only begun to reveal their shape. The horizon of Korath Prime was a shattered panorama of fire, smoke, and ruin. Yet beneath the chaos, the subtle pulse of resistance persisted. Zarak stood upon the bridge of Acheron's resolve, his gaze fixed upon the war-torn landscape, the distant embers of crumbling cities reflecting in his immortal eyes. The northern highlands had long since fallen, their ruins silent but for the echo of firestorms and collapsing fortifications. Yet the southern detachments, those persistent nodes of hesitation and whispered counsel, had become the true crucible of command. Their indecision, their whispered debates, and their subtle deviations had grown more tangible, manifesting into acts that bordered on insubordination. Vailor approached, his armor humming softly with the energy that coursed through the vessel. "My lord," he said, voice quiet yet insistent, "our observations confirm what we feared. The southern detachments are coordinating independently, beyond your direct orders. Some officers now challenge the necessity of continued annihilation. Others manipulate supply lines and communication relays in ways that are subtle but deliberate." Zarak's jaw tightened. Even after centuries of conquest, the subtleties of human ambition and conscience remained a variable he could not fully control. Deliberate, yes, and dangerous. We have tolerated whispers, measured hesitation, and observed counsel. But this is beyond passive doubt. It is action disguised as obedience. Draven entered the chamber, projection tablet in hand. "Sir, reconnaissance confirms irregular movements. Officers in the southeastern theaters have adjusted their positions independently, anticipating enemy maneuvers before they occur. It is coordinated, precise, and calculated. It is no accident. It is deliberate intervention." Zarak's armored hand rested on the console, feeling the hum of energy beneath him, as though it were an extension of his own will. Immortality granted foresight, but foresight did not erase the danger of subtle treachery. "Then we act," he said finally. "Observation alone is no longer sufficient. Precision and consequence will guide our response. Vailor, lead a detachment to the southeastern theater. Measure the loyalty of every officer in that sector. Draven, coordinate orbital suppression to contain any emergent threats. Every hesitation, every deviation must be accounted for and corrected." As Vailor departed, Zarak allowed a rare reflection upon the weight of command. He had faced rebellion before, countless times across countless worlds. Yet this insidious form of dissent, quiet, calculated, and morally justified in the minds of those who enacted it, was unlike any challenge he had encountered. It was a war waged not only in the external theatres of fire and steel, but within the hearts and minds of those who had sworn allegiance. The bridge fell into tense silence. Zarak's thoughts traced the intricate web of loyalty, hesitation, and moral ambiguity that now defined the southern detachments. The Iron Warriors were forged in discipline, yet even they were not immune to the subtle pull of conscience. Each officer carried the weight of choice, and every choice had consequences that could ripple outward, undermining cohesion and threatening the fragile stability of command. A subtle alarm drew attention. Dreven's voice was clipped. "Sir, an unanticipated strike has breached the western siege lines. Casualties are higher than anticipated. The assault demonstrates knowledge of our internal patterns. Coordination suggests deliberate interference. Some southern officers may have facilitated this strike, or at least failed to prevent it." Zarak's gaze narrowed. "Then it is time for decisive clarity. Valor, intercept and determine the origin of this breach. Measure the loyalty of all officers involved and enforce discipline where hesitation threatens cohesion. Dreven, ensure orbital suppression is precise. No collateral loss beyond what is necessary to maintain control. Every action must reinforce both obedience and the subtle acknowledgement of conscience." As the orders were executed, Zarak remained upon the bridge, observing the distant infernos. Immortality had given him perspective across centuries, yet even centuries could not prepare one for the quiet, insidious betrayal of conscience within ranks forged by steel and discipline. He recalled previous sieges, fortresses reduced to ash, legions disciplined into unyielding cohesion, but none had tested him so thoroughly in matters of loyalty, morality, and the subtle fracture between obedience and conscience. Hours passed as the detachment moved into position. The orbital bombardments continued. The ground assault proceeded with precise ruthlessness, and yet the tension persisted. Whispered counsel among officers, minor deviations from orders, and subtle coordination outside the chain of command had begun to coalesce into discernible patterns. Each act was small, almost imperceptible, yet collectively they carried the weight of a slow-burning betrayal. A new communication flickered to life, Lieutenant Merith's face resolving in sharp clarity. Her expression was composed, yet the tension in her eyes betrayed concern. "Praetor Zarak," she began, "we have confirmed the coordination among southern officers. Some are deliberately circumventing orders, arguing for restraint in select theatres, and subtly influencing their subordinates. It is not open rebellion, but it is deliberate and calculated. I suspect some are observing your actions as closely as you observe theirs." Zarak's armoured hand pressed lightly against the console. The hum beneath his touch was a reminder of control and precision. "Then we observe, measure, and respond with exactitude. Every hesitation, every whisper, every act of subtle defiance carries consequence. The crucible of loyalty, obedience, and conscience is underway, and I will endure it as I always have." The fires of Korath Prime flared, the smoke rising into the void, twisting toward the distant stars like dark omens. The siege was no longer merely a war of fire, steel, and strategy. It was a battle of hearts, minds, and conscience. Even immortals were subject to consequence, and Zarak understood with perfect clarity that the choices made now, by both captains and praetor, would echo across centuries. And as he stood upon the bridge, observing the subtle fractures in both the battlefield and the hearts of his own officers, Zarak resolved silently. The war of Korath Prime was far from over, and the first irreversible consequences of hesitation and betrayal were beginning to manifest. Loyalty would be tested, conscience would challenge obedience, and the true nature of command, immortal, unyielding, yet burdened with consequence, would be revealed in the days to come. The air over Korath Prime was thick with smoke and ash, yet beneath the suffocating haze, the faint pulse of resistance persisted, stubborn and insistent. Zarak stood upon the bridge of Acheron's resolve, his immortal gaze fixed on the devastated landscape below. Cities had fallen, fortifications had crumbled, and the northern highlands were a testament to the unrelenting might of the Iron Warriors. Yet the southern detachments, with their whispered counsel and subtle deviations, had become the true crucible of command. Hesitation had matured into something more tangible, a quiet conspiracy that now carried the weight of consequence. Valor approached, his armor resonating softly with the hum of energy that sustained the vessel. "My lord," he said quietly, "the southern detachments have begun to act with coordinated independence. Some officers argue openly for restraint in the southern theaters, while others facilitate subtle deviations from protocol. These actions, while not overt rebellion, threaten cohesion." Zarek's jaw tightened, the shadow of centuries of command pressing upon him. Even immortals were not immune to the consequences of hesitation, nor to the subtle fractures it produced among those entrusted to execute their will. "Deliberate, yes," he murmured. "Dangerous, indeed. Observation alone is insufficient. Precision, consequence, and understanding must guide our response. Every whisper, every deviation must be accounted for and measured." Draven entered, projection tablet in hand, the hollow display flickering with subtle shifts in battlefield coordination. "Sir, reconnaissance confirms that officers in the southeastern theaters have been sharing strategic information, coordinating independently, and making tactical adjustments without reporting to Central Command. Their actions are precise and calculated. The question is no longer whether they hesitate. It is whether their hesitation will escalate into outright defiance." Zarek's armored fingers pressed against the console. Immortality had granted foresight, yet foresight did not erase the danger posed by subtle betrayal. "Then we act," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Valor, take a detachment to the southeastern lines. Assess the loyalty of all officers. Intervene where hesitation threatens cohesion. Draven, coordinate orbital support to ensure containment. Every decision, every movement must reinforce both obedience and the acknowledgement of conscience." Valor departed silently, leaving Zarek in contemplation. Immortality had exposed him to countless forms of rebellion. Yet this insidious strain, quiet, calculated, and morally justified in the minds of those who enacted it, was unlike any he had faced. The Iron Warriors, disciplined and perfected through centuries of war, now contended with the unpredictability of conscience, ambition, and subtle dissent. Hours passed as orbital bombardments continued, precise and calculated. The fires below painted the planet in crimson and gold, the ruins of cities reflecting the complexity of the internal war among Zarek's officers. Whispered counsel, independent coordination, and subtle defiance persisted, weaving a web that threatened to fracture cohesion. Even minor deviations now carried the weight of potential catastrophe. A chime heralded a new communication. Lieutenant Merith's expression appeared on the projection, composed but tense. "Praetor Zarek," she began, "our observations confirm the coordinated independence of Southern officers. Some argue for restraint, others influence tactical adjustments without reporting. It is deliberate, calculated, and persistent. I suspect that some monitor your actions as closely as you monitor theirs. Zarak's gaze hardened. Then we respond. Observation alone has reached its limit. Consequence must accompany action. Every hesitation, every deviation will be weighed and addressed. Loyalty is not inherited, it is earned and maintained. Conscience informs action, but it may not override command. The fires of Korath Prime flared once more, the smoke twisting toward the void, a visual reminder that the siege was no longer merely a war of fire and steel. It had become a battle of hearts, minds, and the subtle machinations of morality. Even immortals were subject to consequence. Even immortals must endure the slow-burning fracture of loyalty. An alarm cut through the tense quiet. Dreven's voice was clipped. "Sir, a coordinated strike has breached the western siege lines. Casualties are higher than expected. Preliminary analysis suggests that the southern detachments facilitated or failed to prevent this strike. It is deliberate." Zarak's eyes narrowed, the weight of centuries pressing down upon him. "Then we act decisively. Vailor, intercept the western breach and measure the loyalty of all officers involved. Execute corrective action where necessary. Dreven, ensure orbital suppression contains the threat without unnecessary collateral. Every movement, every decision must reinforce discipline while acknowledging the subtle forces of conscience." Vailor departed immediately, leaving Zarak alone on the bridge. He watched the distant fires, reflecting on the paradox of command. Immortality granted perspective, strategy, and foresight, yet it also magnified the subtle fractures of loyalty and conscience. The Iron Warriors, instruments of precision and discipline, now bore the weight of human hesitation, the whisper of doubt that could unravel centuries of order. Hours stretched into tense calculation. Orbital bombardments continued. Ground assaults moved with measured ruthlessness, and yet subtle fractures persisted. Officers whispered among themselves. Captains coordinated independently, and minor deviations compounded into discernible patterns. Each act, though small, was a thread in the fabric of a slow-burning betrayal. Another communication flickered to life. Captain Lyran appeared, her expression taut. "Praetor Zarak," she said, "the southern detachments report officers coordinating beyond protocol. They argue for restraint, challenge certain orders, and subtly influence subordinates. It is deliberate, calculated, and persistent. I suspect some observe your actions as closely as you observe theirs." Zarak's armored hand pressed against the console. The hum beneath his touch was a reminder of control and precision. "Then we observe, measure, and respond. Every action, every whisper, every hesitation carries consequence. The crucible of loyalty, obedience, and conscience is underway, and I will endure it, as I always have." The fires of Korath Prime flared, twisting toward the distant stars. Zarak understood, with clarity forged through centuries, that this siege was no longer merely a battle of fire and steel. It was a test of hearts, minds, and the subtle fractures of loyalty. Immortality did not absolve one from consequence. It ensured that every choice, every hesitation, and every act of obedience or defiance would echo across eternity. And as he stood upon the bridge, observing both the battlefield and the intricate fractures among his own officers, Zarak resolved silently. The war of Korath Prime was far from over, and the consequences of hesitation and subtle betrayal would soon erupt into irreversible action. Loyalty would be tested, conscience would challenge obedience, and the true nature of command, immortal, unyielding, yet burdened with consequence, would be revealed in the coming days. The smoke above Korath Prime had thickened into a near-permanent veil, blotting out stars and twisting the light of distant suns into a dull, bloodied hue. Zarak stood on the bridge of Acheron's resolve, gazing down upon the shattered remnants of cities that had once flourished with life and purpose. The northern highlands lay in ruin, a testament to the relentless discipline of the Iron Warriors. Yet it was the southern detachments, the whispered dissenters, the hesitant officers, the subtle conspirators who had become the true test of command. Vailor approached silently, his steps measured and deliberate. "My lord," he said quietly, "the breach in the western siege lines has resulted in severe losses. Reports indicate deliberate obstruction in the supply chains and minor miscommunications engineered by southern officers. Casualties are mounting, and morale, though disciplined, is strained." Zarak's jaw tightened. He had anticipated hesitation, calculated dissent, and even questioned loyalty across centuries of command. But the subtle insubordination of the southern detachments had escalated beyond mere whispers. "Then the time for subtlety has passed," he murmured. "Every hesitation, every deviation must now be met with measured action. Observation alone is insufficient. We will test loyalty in a way that is both precise and undeniable." Draven stepped forward, projection tablet illuminating the bridge with detailed movements of forces across the planet. "Sir, reconnaissance confirms that certain officers in the southeastern sectors have been transmitting information independently, coordinating positions in anticipation of enemy movements. This coordination is deliberate, calculated, and outside of your direct orders. The line between conscientious decision and betrayal is becoming indistinct." Zarak's armored fingers pressed lightly against the console. Immortality had granted him foresight, strategy, and centuries of perspective. Yet foresight did not erase the consequences of human conscience and ambition. "Then we act decisively. Vailor, lead a contingent to the southeastern sectors. Assess loyalty, measure hesitation, and execute corrective action where necessary. Draven, coordinate orbital suppression to contain emergent threats without unnecessary collateral. Every act, every choice must reinforce both obedience and the subtle acknowledgement of conscience." Vailor departed, leaving Zarak in contemplation. The Iron Warriors, instruments of steel and discipline, were facing an enemy of a different kind, the unpredictable calculus of moral choice. Even the most loyal soldiers could hesitate, weigh consequences, or subtly manipulate outcomes. Immortality had not prepared him for this, not in centuries of campaigns, not in the fall of entire worlds. Hours passed in tense calculation. Orbital bombardments continued. The ground assault pressed with ruthless precision, yet subtle fractures in loyalty persisted. Officers whispered counsel to one another. Captains coordinated outside the chain of command, and minor deviations compounded into discernible patterns. Each act, though seemingly inconsequential, bore the weight of a slow-burning mutiny. A communication flickered to life. Lieutenant Merith's face appeared, composed but shadowed with concern. "Praetor Zarak," she began, "the southern detachments report officers circumventing orders. They argue for selective restraint and influence tactical adjustments beyond your direct command. Some actions have already affected battlefield outcomes. It is deliberate and persistent. I suspect many observe your decisions as closely as you observe theirs." Zarak's eyes narrowed. "Then we will meet subtlety with precision. Observation has revealed the fracture. Now we will test its strength. Every hesitation, every whisper, every act of independent choice will carry consequence. Loyalty is not a matter of expectation. It is earned and maintained, and defiance, even subtle, must be confronted." The fires of Korath Prime flared again, casting the charred terrain into stark relief. The siege was no longer merely a contest of fire and steel. It had become a test of conscience, loyalty, and the endurance of discipline under the corrosive weight of subtle betrayal. Immortality did not absolve Zarak from consequence. It magnified it, ensuring that every choice, every hesitation, and every act of obedience or defiance would resonate across centuries. An alarm interrupted the tense silence. Dreven's voice was clipped and urgent. "Sir, the enemy has exploited the breaches caused by southern hesitations. Casualties are significant, and resistance has regained momentum in several sectors. It appears the southern officers' independent coordination facilitated these outcomes, whether intentionally or through inaction." Zarak's armored hand tightened upon the console, a subtle tremor betraying the weight of centuries pressing upon him. "Then the test has begun," he said, voice low and precise. "Valor, ensure the western and southeastern sectors are contained. Every officer must demonstrate loyalty under pressure. Draven, calibrate orbital suppression to minimize unnecessary loss while maximizing the demonstration of consequence. The crucible of loyalty is now active." Vailor departed immediately, leaving Zarak alone on the bridge. He stared at the fires below, reflecting on the paradox of command. Immortality granted strategy, perspective, and foresight, yet it also magnified the subtle fractures of human conscience. The Iron Warriors were perfected through centuries of war, yet even perfection could not eradicate the unpredictability of choice. Each hesitation, each whisper, each minor deviation now carried tangible consequences. The hours stretched, tense and measured. Orbital bombardments continued with relentless precision. Ground assaults pressed forward with ruthless discipline, yet whispers persisted among the southern detachments. Officers debated tactics, questioned the necessity of total destruction, and subtly coordinated their actions. The fractures were no longer theoretical. They were active forces shaping the outcome of the siege. A new communication flickered into view. Captain Lyron's face resolved, composed, yet tense. "Praetor Zarak," she said, "we have confirmed deliberate coordination among southern officers. They act independently, argue for restraint, and subtly manipulate outcomes. Their actions have affected the battlefield and casualties. I suspect they monitor your every decision as closely as you monitor theirs." Zarak's armored hand pressed firmly against the console. The hum beneath his touch was a reminder of control amidst uncertainty. "Then we respond with decisive clarity. Every act of hesitation, every whispered counsel, every subtle deviation will be addressed. The crucible of loyalty, obedience, and conscience has reached its critical stage, and I will endure it as I always have." The fires of Korath Prime flared once more, rising toward the void, twisting against distant stars. Zarak understood with cold clarity that the siege was no longer merely a war of fire and steel. It was a battle of hearts, minds, and the subtle fractures of loyalty. Immortality did not protect one from consequence. It ensured that every choice, every hesitation, and every act of obedience or defiance would echo across eternity. And as he stood upon the bridge, observing the battlefield and the fissures among his own officers, Zarak resolved silently. The War of Korath Prime had entered its decisive phase, where hesitation and subtle betrayal would manifest into irreversible consequences. Loyalty would be tested, conscience would challenge obedience, and the enduring weight of command, immortal, unyielding, yet burdened with consequence, would shape the outcome of both the planet and the Iron Warriors themselves. The sky over Korath Prime was a roiling tempest of smoke fire, and ash, each plume twisting upward like the fingers of gods accusing the living. Zarak stood upon the bridge of Acheron's resolve, the faint tremor of the vessel beneath his feet, echoing the storm raging both outside and within. The northern highlands lay in ruin, their ruins a testament to the Iron Warrior's precision and relentlessness. Yet it was the southern detachments, those subtle conspirators whose quiet defiance now dictated the course of the siege. Their hesitation had hardened into deliberate action, and the consequences of their choices were now unfolding with undeniable clarity. Vailor approached, his armor glinting dimly in the fractured light. "My lord," he said quietly, "the breaches caused by southern indecision have escalated. Resistance forces have exploited these openings. Several officers have openly defied orders, directing assets independently. Casualties are mounting, and our disciplined advance is faltering." Zarak's eyes, cold and immortal, swept across the war-torn surface of the planet. He had anticipated hesitation, calculated dissent, and even subtle betrayal over centuries of campaigns. Yet nothing had prepared him for this. Open defiance that emerged from moral reasoning, from the conscience of those bound to obey. "Then the time for testing has ended," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Observation and subtle enforcement are no longer sufficient. Every deviation will carry consequence. Every whisper of rebellion will be met with decisive action." Driven stepped forward, projection tablet casting a ghostly glow across the bridge. "Sir, reconnaissance confirms multiple southern officers are now coordinating openly, redirecting forces and supplies independently. Some have taken positions that compromise our siege strategy. This is deliberate, calculated, and no longer subtle. The line between loyalty and betrayal has been crossed." Zarak's armored fingers brushed the edge of the console, feeling the pulse of energy beneath as though it were an extension of his own will. Immortality had granted him foresight, strategy, and centuries of experience. Yet foresight did not mitigate the consequences of moral fracture within his ranks. Then action is inevitable. Vailor, lead a contingent to confront these officers, measure loyalty, enforce discipline, and if necessary, execute corrective action without hesitation. Driven, coordinate orbital support to contain breaches while minimizing collateral damage beyond what is necessary to assert authority. Vailor departed without a word, his presence a silent testament to centuries of loyalty. Zarak remained, reflecting on the paradox of command. Immortality granted the vision to see centuries unfold, yet it magnified the subtle fractures of conscience and ambition. Even the most disciplined soldiers could hesitate, weigh consequences, or act independently, and the result was now visible in the rising chaos below. Hours passed in tense, silent calculation. Orbital bombardments continued with mechanical precision, and ground assaults pressed forward with relentless rigor, yet the subtle fractures had solidified into overt defiance. Officers whispered counsel openly, captains acted independently, and minor deviations had coalesced into actions that now threatened the integrity of the siege. Each act, though seemingly small, carried the weight of consequence amplified across the battlefield. A sudden communication flickered to life. Captain Lyran appeared, her expression taut, a mixture of loyalty and fear warring across her features. "Praetor Zarak," she began, voice trembling slightly, "we have confirmed that several southern officers are now openly defying orders. They redirect units, manipulate supply lines, and influence subordinates. Casualties are mounting due to their interventions. This is deliberate and persistent. They have begun to undermine the cohesion of our forces in multiple sectors simultaneously." Zarak's gaze hardened, the weight of centuries pressing upon him. "Then the crucible has begun," he said quietly. "Every deviation, every act of defiance will carry consequence. Loyalty is not assumed, it is earned and maintained. Conscience informs action, but it may not override command. Those who cannot reconcile this will face judgment." The fires of Korath Prime flared violently, reflecting the moral and physical chaos now intertwined upon the planet. The siege was no longer a simple contest of fire and steel. It had become a battle of hearts, minds, and the fractures of loyalty. Even immortals were subject to consequence, and Zarak understood, with perfect clarity, that the choices made in these hours would echo across centuries. An alarm sounded sharply. Dreven's voice was tight with urgency. "Sir, multiple sectors have fallen into disarray. Breaches created by defiant officers are being exploited by resistance forces. Casualties are severe. Coordination suggests deliberate orchestration rather than negligence." Zarak's armored hand tightened on the console, a subtle tremor betraying the weight of command. "Then confrontation is necessary," he said. "Valor, ensure all rebellious officers are identified. Execute corrective measures immediately. Dreven, adjust orbital suppression to enforce discipline while maintaining minimal essential support. The crucible of loyalty has become absolute. Those who cannot reconcile conscience with command will be broken or removed." Vylor's detachment moved swiftly, descending upon the southeastern sectors. Officers who had whispered in corridors now faced the full weight of Zarak's judgment. Commands were executed with ruthless efficiency, decisions measured not only in tactical outcome but in moral consequence. The first confrontations erupted in silence and precision. Subordinates were separated from their leaders. Hesitant officers were tested, and the subtle fractures of loyalty were made visible in the harsh light of authority. Zarak remained on the bridge, observing, calculating, and weighing each consequence. The Iron Warriors were disciplined, perfected, and relentless, yet even their precision could not erase the human element. Conscience, hesitation, and moral reasoning had now crystallized into action, and the repercussions were tangible. Lives would be lost, loyalties tested, and the subtle fractures of centuries-long discipline would be exposed in full. Hours stretched into tense, meticulous observation. Orbital bombardments continued to support the ground assault, the fires below painting the charred landscape in stark relief. Officers confronted their own hesitations, and subtle conspiracies erupted into overt consequences. The War of Korath Prime had entered its decisive phase, where hesitation, conscience, and loyalty collided under the crushing weight of consequence. Zarak understood with unyielding clarity that the true test of command had begun. The subtle betrayals that had festered for weeks were now irreversible, and the moral crucible of loyalty, obedience, and conscience would determine not only the outcome of the siege, but the integrity of the Iron Warriors themselves. Choices had been made, consequences were manifesting, and the cost of hesitation could no longer be ignored. And as he stood upon the bridge, observing both the battlefield and the unraveling of subtle loyalty, Zarak resolved silently. The next decisions, the next actions, would define not only the fate of Korath Prime, but the enduring legacy of the Iron Warriors, tempered by the unyielding weight of consequence, conscience, and immortal command. The sky above Korath Prime had become a tapestry of fire and shadow, the distant stars obscured by ash and smoke that twisted like dark serpents into the void. Zarak stood upon the bridge of Acheron's resolve, his eyes cold and unyielding, fixed upon the devastated landscape below. The northern highlands had been reduced to ruin. The southern detachments had fractured into subtle conspiracies, and the first irreversible consequences of hesitation had begun to manifest. The Iron Warrior's disciplined precision was tested not by the enemy alone, but by the moral and strategic fractures that had emerged from within. Vailor approached, his armor echoing the weight of centuries of service. "My lord," he said, voice measured yet tense. "The breaches in multiple sectors have widened. Resistance forces exploit these openings with unprecedented coordination. Officers previously hesitant have now openly defied orders, consolidating forces and directing assets independently. Casualties are mounting, and cohesion is strained." Zarek's gaze swept over the planet, observing the slow, inexorable unraveling of both strategy and loyalty. Immortality had granted him perspective and foresight, yet it had also magnified the consequences of subtle betrayal. "Then decisive confrontation is required," he said quietly. "Observation alone is no longer sufficient. Every act of defiance, every deviation, will be met with absolute consequence. Loyalty is not inherited. It is forged, maintained, and enforced." Dreven stepped forward, projection tablet flickering with the movements of southern detachments. "Sir, reconnaissance confirms that certain officers have now coordinated openly, redirecting forces in ways that compromise siege integrity. Their actions are deliberate, calculated, and persistent. The line between loyalty and betrayal is irrevocably crossed." Zarek's armored hand pressed against the console. Immortality had not diminished the weight of choice. It had only amplified it. Then action must be swift and exact. Vailor led a contingent to the southeastern sectors. Confront these officers. Test their loyalty. Execute corrective measures where necessary. Dreven, calibrate orbital suppression to enforce discipline and prevent further breaches, minimizing unnecessary loss but ensuring unmistakable authority. The crucible of command has reached its zenith. Vailor departed immediately, moving with silent precision. Zarek remained, reflecting on the paradox of command. The Iron Warriors were perfected instruments of discipline, yet even perfection could not eradicate the human element of choice. Hesitation, conscience, and ambition had coalesced into deliberate defiance, and the consequences were now visible in the bloody chaos below. Hours passed, tense and deliberate. Orbital bombardments continued with measured ruthlessness, and ground assaults pressed forward with inexorable precision. Yet subtle fractures had hardened into open defiance. Officers whispered counsel openly. Captains redirected forces independently, and minor deviations had escalated into irreversible acts. Each movement carried weight, and each choice bore consequence amplified across the battlefield. A sudden communication flickered to life. Captain Lyran appeared, her expression taut, a mixture of fear and loyalty. "Praetor Zarek," she said, voice trembling, "we have confirmed that several southern officers have fully consolidated their independent actions. They manipulate subordinates, redirect assets, and challenge direct orders. Casualties are high, and cohesion is at risk. Some actions appear deliberate, others morally justified in their own minds, but all compromise the siege." Zarek's gaze hardened, the weight of centuries pressing upon him. "Then the crucible is now absolute," he said. "Every deviation, every whispered counsel, every act of defiance will carry consequence. Conscience informs action, but it may not override command. Those unable to reconcile obedience and moral reasoning will be broken or removed. The judgment of loyalty is inevitable." The fires of Korath Prime flared violently, casting long shadows across the charred surface. The siege had evolved into a test of morality, loyalty, and consequence, where hesitation and subtle betrayal had now become overt actions with irreversible effects. Even immortals were subject to the weight of consequence, and Zarak understood that the choices of these hours would echo across centuries. An alarm cut through the tense hum of the bridge. Dreven's voice was precise but urgent. "Sir, multiple sectors are in chaos. Breaches caused by defiant officers are being exploited. Casualties are severe. Coordination suggests deliberate orchestration rather than mere negligence. The first irreversible consequences are manifest." Zarek's armored hand clenched upon the console, a subtle tremor betraying the immense weight of command. "Then confrontation is absolute," he said. "Vailor, engage the southeastern and western sectors with maximum precision. Identify and isolate all officers unable to reconcile conscience with obedience. Draven, adjust orbital support to enforce discipline while minimizing unnecessary loss. The crucible of loyalty is complete, and the test is final." Vailor's contingent moved swiftly, descending upon the fractured sectors. Officers who had whispered in corridors now faced the full weight of Zarak's judgment. Commands were executed with brutal clarity, testing not only tactical skill, but moral alignment. Those who hesitated, those who prioritized conscience over obedience, were separated from their units, measured, and, where necessary, removed. Subtle fractures became visible in the full light of judgment, each act of defiance given consequence. Zarak observed the unfolding scene with relentless precision. The Iron Warriors were disciplined and relentless, yet even their perfected structure could not erase the human element of choice. Conscience, hesitation, and moral reasoning had now erupted into consequences that were tangible and irreversible. The siege of Korath Prime had entered its climax, where hesitation, loyalty, and moral judgment collided under the weight of centuries of command. Hours passed in meticulous observation. Orbital bombardments continued, ground assaults pressed forward, and subtle conspiracies erupted into overt consequences. Officers confronted their own hesitations. Subordinates acted under scrutiny, and the fractures of centuries-long discipline were fully exposed. The war had become a test of hearts and minds, as much as fire and steel. Zarak understood, with unyielding clarity, that the ultimate measure of command had begun. The subtle betrayals that had simmered for weeks were now irreversible, and the moral crucible of loyalty, obedience, and conscience would determine not only the fate of Korath Prime, but the integrity of the Iron Warriors themselves. The next decisions, the next actions, would define the legacy of centuries of conquest and immortal authority. And as he stood upon the bridge, observing both the battlefield and the unfolding consequences of moral fracture, Zarak resolved silently. The climax of Korath Prime would reveal the true nature of loyalty, the cost of conscience, and the enduring weight of command, immortal, unyielding, and absolute. The fires of Korath Prime had finally begun to fade, leaving the planet scarred and silent, a desolate monument to centuries of war and the cost of command. Zarak stood upon the bridge of Acheron's resolve, the vessel's hum the only accompaniment to the echo of ruined cities below. The northern highlands lay in ashes, the southern detachments had been fractured and purged, and the last whispers of rebellion had been extinguished with relentless precision. Yet victory was not triumph. It was a quiet, somber realization that the cost of obedience and discipline was measured in lives, loyalty, and conscience. Vailor approached, his gait slower than usual, as though the weight of recent events pressed upon even him. "My lord," he said, voice subdued, The southern detachments have been neutralized. Forces that acted independently have either been removed or reintegrated under strict oversight. The siege is technically complete. Resistance has been crushed, though remnants scatter among the highlands and wastelands. Casualties are unprecedented, and morale is fractured. Zarek's gaze lingered on the ruined cities, the smoke curling like dark ribbons toward the void. Immortality had granted him perspective across countless centuries, yet the finality of consequence still weighed heavily. "Then it is done," he murmured, voice low, carrying the weight of unspoken truths. "The siege is complete, but victory carries no celebration. Every choice, every hesitation, every act of subtle defiance has been paid for in full." Dreven's projection illuminated the battlefield, displaying the skeletal remnants of entire detachments, scorched fortresses, and fractured supply lines. "Sir," he said carefully, "the final tally confirms what we feared. Loyal forces remain disciplined, yet the subtle fractures caused by prior hesitation have left permanent consequences. Even reintegrated units bear the mark of conscience tested against command. The Iron Warriors endure, but at a cost few can comprehend." Zarek's armored fingers traced the edge of the console. Immortality offered clarity, perspective, and foresight, yet it did not shield one from regret or the corrosive weight of consequence. He had maintained order, enforced loyalty, and crushed hesitation, but the echoes of subtle betrayal still resonated. Lives had been lost, choices had been made, and the delicate balance between obedience and conscience had left scars deeper than any firestorm. Vela's voice broke the silence again. "My lord, we have consolidated command. Loyal officers have been reinstated. The remaining resistance is scattered, no longer coordinated. The siege is over, but I sense the weight upon you remains." Zarek's gaze hardened, reflecting the burning horizon. "It remains because leadership carries not only triumph, but the burden of every consequence. Immortality grants the perspective to witness history unfold, yet it does not absolve one from the cost of command. The lives lost, the moral compromises, the fractures of loyalty, all remain etched into eternity." Hours passed in quiet reflection, the distant glow of dying fires painting the bridge in red and gold. Zarek considered the subtle betrayals, the hesitation, and the moral dilemmas that had shaped the final days of the siege. The southern detachments, once instruments of precise discipline, had challenged not only his authority but the very nature of command. Their choices, guided by conscience yet tempered by fear, ambition, and survival, had created irreversible consequences that would endure beyond the siege itself. A faint alarm flickered. Dreven's voice was subdued, almost hesitant. "Sir, there is a residual signal detected among the southern wastelands. It is minimal, disorganized, yet persistent. Some resistance survives, uncoordinated, but alive." Zarek's gaze did not waver. "Then let them remain. There is no need to extinguish every spark. Immortality teaches patience and perspective. The universe endures, as do consequences. Let this be a testament. The Iron Warriors enforce order, but the balance between obedience and conscience is eternal. Let it be remembered that even the smallest hesitation carries weight." Vylor inclined his head, silent, understanding the lesson etched in his praetor's gaze. Dreven's projection dimmed, the skeletal remnants of cities and detachments frozen in meticulous record. Zarek's eyes, cold and eternal, scanned the horizon one last time. The siege was over, yet the consequences of choice, loyalty, and moral compromise would ripple outward across the centuries, leaving indelible marks upon the survivors and upon history itself. The bridge fell into silence. Outside, Korath Prime lay in ruin, a testament to fire, discipline, and the unyielding weight of command. Inside, Zarek reflected upon the paradox of immortality: to witness centuries, to command legions, and yet remain bound to the consequences of mortal hesitation. The Iron Warriors would endure, perfected instruments of war, yet even they bore the subtle scars of conscience challenged by authority. A final report came from Draven. "Sir, the remaining forces are secured. The siege lines hold, and loyal officers are reinstated. The cost is total, but operational integrity remains. The Iron Warriors endure, though every action has left its mark." Zarek's armored hand rested upon the console. "So it is. The siege is complete, yet victory is tempered by the echoes of consequence. Immortality allows perspective, but not absolution. Every choice, every hesitation, every act of subtle defiance has been paid for in full. The balance between obedience and conscience endures, and it is eternal." He turned from the console, observing the barren horizon. The fires had dimmed, leaving smoke curling toward the void, like silent testament. Cities lay. In ruin, detachments bore the weight of command tested to its limits, and the subtle fractures of loyalty had been exposed, endured, and corrected. Immortality granted Zarek perspective across time, yet it did not soften the cost. He understood, as he always had, that the true measure of command was not victory alone, but the endurance of consequence. Vylor and Draven remained silent, understanding the weight of what had transpired. The Iron Warriors had enforced discipline, crushed hesitation, and ensured loyalty. Yet the human element, the subtle conscience, the hesitation, the moral fracture, remained a persistent and eternal challenge. The siege was over, yet the echoes of choice, consequence, and moral judgment would endure, immortal as the praetor himself. Zarek turned from the window, the dying light of Korath Prime reflecting in his eyes. The siege was complete. The fires had faded. Loyalty had been tested. Conscience had been challenged, and obedience had been enforced. Immortality ensured that the consequences would echo across centuries. The Iron Warriors would endure. The universe would endure. And Zarek, eternal witness and executor of consequence, would carry the weight of this siege forever. The stars beyond Korath Prime remained hidden behind ash and smoke, yet in that darkness lay clarity. Victory was never absolute, loyalty was never perfect, and conscience would always challenge authority. Immortality did not absolve from the consequences of choice. It magnified them. The cost of command had been paid in full, and the echoes of that cost would endure far longer than the fires of war. And as Zarek stood upon the bridge, silent and eternal, he understood fully that the siege of Korath Prime was both an end and a testament. The balance between obedience and conscience, loyalty and betrayal, mortality and immortality was eternal, unyielding, and unresolvable.